dear friends. Welcome back to the next session on operations planning, scheduling, and control. Now let's begin with our learning. In this particular session, we'll be understanding and dealing with the concept of managing cost reduction imperatives, the learning objectives. At the end of this particular session, the learners will be able to understand what do we mean by managing the cost reduction imperatives, what are the various roles of operations in conducting and managing the cost reduction imperatives, describe how to control the cost in an operational organization. Now let's begin with our learning. First, we'll understand what do we mean by managing the cost reduction imperatives. The cost reduction is a strategy that has been adopted by the business organization to cut their expenses while they are increasing their earnings. So every organization is aiming to reduce the cost that has been associated in an organization, and they are always trying to increase their amount of earnings or the savings that they are earning. In a business organization or manufacturing unit, the various costs that have been incurred are the prime cost, which is always related with the direct material, direct labor, and direct expenses. The next consideration is the factory cost, which is related to the factory expenses. The next consideration is the office cost, which is related to the office and administration expenses. And lastly, the selling and distribution cost, which is related to the selling and distribution expenses. So certain types of overheads or the activities or the expenses have been incurred, and on those particular consideration, the organization or the manufacturing unit or the business, they are always aiming to cut down their cost at the various levels. So typically the companies do not have a place on high priority on cost. When launching a new product, they focus on how they can control the cost and accordingly, how they can have a better consideration as to the management of cost. When there is a more competition and pricing becomes a differentiator in the market, cost becomes more relevant, and hence the more preference is given for the cost as to how we can control and avoid the various perspectives as to the cost reduction. Now let's understand what the various objectives of cost reduction. The various objectives of cost reduction are: the goal of cost cutting is to lower the price per unit of a product or per unit of a service. So always the concept of cost reduction is aiming to cut down the cost at the lower price level so as to save an additional amount of money on the product or service that we are delivering. The second objective of cost reduction is to, if the price of the input elements falls, the unit cost may fall. So if there is a reduction in the cost of the inputs, then so accordingly, there will be the reduction in cost of outputs or the total cost of the particular products also. So that's the objective of cost reduction, wherein it focuses initially on the cost of inputs, and accordingly, the unit cost of per unit for a certain product or commodity also falls or it reduces simultaneously. However, in the other situation, the decrease will not be genuine and long lasting. So the organization must also has to see that the favorable or continuous decrease in the cost is also not genuine and it is not a long lasting situation, wherein continuous decrease in the cost or reduction in the cost may reduce to a certain product, and accordingly the total cost of the production may go down and the qualitative factors may get impacted in the business organization, and hence continuous reduction of cost must also be at certain times avoided. Now let us understand what are the various features of the cost reduction. Okay, so the various features of cost reduction that have been there or that have been observed are: setting the objectives and criteria aren't the part of cost cutting processes. So when we set the different objectives and the various criteria are being set for a business organization, the cost cutting process or objectives needs to be identified and it needs to be ascertained by the organization in the requirement department or for a product or a particular material. So setting objectives is essentially necessary and it must be a part of the cost cutting process. And hence there must be a differentiation about how do we set a certain objective, what criteria have been set, and how cost cutting processes can be implied or can be used in the business. The goal of cost cutting is to raise the bar. So the goal or the aim of the cost cutting is always to reduce the bar in which we can have a control on all the costs that have been incurred. That is with respect to the direct cost, prime cost, factory cost, office costs, selling and distribution cost, and so on. So we have to increase the bar. We have to increase the profit percentage ratio, the margin of profits, and the earnings that the organization is looking for. So when we can have a proper control, or when we can cut down the cost at the various levels, we can increase the amount of cost reduction, and hence it can be possible as to increase the level of profits. It is a self-correcting mechanism. So the cost reduction techniques is a self-correcting mechanism in which when one component decreases, the other component simultaneously increases. And when the cost reduction component increases, the profit margin automatically decreases. And hence, We must have a proper understanding as to what mechanism is been adopted, how we implement those mechanisms, and how the features of cost reduction can be applied in the business organization. And hence, the features of cost reduction considers a self-correcting mechanism on from those perspectives. It's a constant, dynamic, and inventive in nature, which continuously focuses on cost-cutting strategies and the various alternatives. So the cost reduction techniques or the features focuses on how we can control the cost at the various levels, how it can be implemented as a part or as a feature of dynamic, constant, and inventive in nature. Various processes or activities that have been undertaken for continuously improving or reduction of a certain cost will help the organization to reduce the cost and increase the profit margin or the percentage of revenue generation at the greater level or at the continuous extent. Now let's understand what the various applications of the operational plan in respect to the cost management processes. The various applications for the continuous process of cost management are the number one, that is the target identification. So whatever target that we have set, we need to identify that particular target, and on the basis of financial imperatives, one organization needs to identify as to what the organization is aiming for and what are the various targets or the goals that have been set. The second perspective is the identification of opportunities. So opportunity quantification, establishing the specific targets is essentially required, and only on those basis, the cost management or continuous process activities can be undertaken. The third perspective focuses on yield improvement planning. So what we are looking for improvement in the yield, that is the productivity, quantity, qualitative improvements of goods, services, and commodities is essentially required. And only on those basis, the improvements can be the yield can be improvised, and according to the various planning strategies can be implemented in the business organization. The action plan implementation. So the implementation of the action plan as to what does it drive to realize the product or realize a certain commodities and so on. So action plan implementation is also very necessary. And from those particular perspectives, various action plan measures can be undertaken. And lastly, the step of applications of for a operational plan is the ongoing monitoring. So there should be a continuous ongoing monitoring activity, which has been undertaken to ensure what is the process in the business organization, how the manufacturing activities have been undertaken, and whether those activities are being conducted in a very better and effective way or not. So ensuring of smooth functioning of all the processes and activities is essentially required, and ongoing monitoring, that is continuous monitoring, is essentially necessary. Now let's understand what are the various cost reduction strategies. So the various cost reduction strategies that an organization can implement are: number one, encouraging the remote working. Number two is improving your negotiation skills. That is, how do we improve or how do we negotiate the product in a better way? Managing the fuel and traveling costs. So control on traveling cost or the transportation cost is essentially necessary. Investing in technology solutions. So we must have a good technology solutions which will save the time of the organization and materials and inventory. Cutting the employee cost. So whatever cost that has been related with the employees, all those costs must be cutted, and accordingly, one organization must try to save the excessive cost on employees. Reduction of the material expenses. So whatever expenses that have been considered in case of a material consideration nature, those material expenses should be reduced in the greater extent. Cutting down the overhead fees. So the overhead cost that is related to the office cost, factory cost, material cost, indirect cost, direct cost, the selling and distribution cost, and so on. All those overhead expenses must be reduced, and it must be controlled in the business organization. And lastly, spending to save. So simultaneously, there should be some amount of spending, which will ultimately lead to the savings of a certain perspective. So these are the various cost reduction strategies due to which organization can save the amount in the long run. Now let's understand what is the differentiation between the cost reduction and the cost control. So cost control is a method for lowering the overall cost of production, and accordingly, cost reduction, on the other hand, tries to lower the product's per unit cost. So that's the major differentiation between the cost reduction and cost control. Cost control focuses on lowering the overall cost of production, that is the total cost, which includes the overhead cost of the direct material, direct labor, direct expenses, prime cost, factory cost, work cost, production cost, selling and distribution cost, and so on. So that is the perspective of control on the total cost is the cost control. And cost reduction, on the other hand, it focuses on lowering the product's cost per unit. So how do we control the per unit cost of a certain product? By controlling all the other expenses. It's the concept of cost reduction. The another concept, that is cost containment, is a short procedure, whereas cost reduction is a longer term approach. In case of a short containment, It is a very short-term procedure that can be followed, but for a cost reduction, there are various set and series and plans of activities that needs to be undertaken, and hence it is a long-term approach. So now let's conclude what we have understood from this particular session. So in terms of the cost reduction techniques, the management accountants are in charge of controlling the product cost factors. And among the other things, the management accountant has to look or they has to see as to how do they control the cost in the long-term perspectives. Controlling of cost, in that is cost control is the short-term perspective, but cost reduction is the long-term perspective, and accordingly, a proper well-coordinated series of activities is required. They link their cost with the efficiency, providing the necessary information for my cost minimization and profit maximization. And those particular long-run situation, we try to minimize the cost and we might try to maximize the profit that has been generated or created in the business organizations. Now let's summarize what we have learned in this particular session. In this particular session, we have understood what do we mean by managing the cost reduction imperatives, what planning has been required in the management organization for the cost reduction imperatives, and how do we implement the management of cost reduction imperatives. I hope you must have enjoyed the learning in this particular session. We'll stay connected and we'll continue with our learning. Thank you for your patience listening. Thank you.